Hello A-level students. I'm going to decided to record a lesson today which will be available for you on YouTube and just covering analysis of one of the texts that you're going to look at for your upcoming assignment. I will also publish the assignment today and I'll give you some idea about examiner feedback on that. And I also wanted to say hello and how are you, and I hope you're well. Fantastic. Okay. The text that we're going to look at will be Visiting Paris, which is another one of the spoken texts, but this time a conversation between Sophia and Mike. And this is a PowerPoint that I'm preparing for a series of PowerPoints that I want to prepare on Paris. It will take, I'd say, 20 minutes, half an hour to go through the details. Before we look at the text, though, I want to show you the examiner's feedback, which you may have seen already. It was in one of the PowerPoints on spoken language that I did. But this was last year's feedback for the Paris question, which I think is really useful. I won't go through it bullet point by bullet point, but you should definitely pause the video, make a note of this, possibly screenshot this and paste it into your notes. You'll notice that the idea of representation is right the way through it. So the idea of the way in which texts present Paris, the representation, or the specific ideas we're being given about Paris, a clear understanding of those is key. There's a lot of comment in there on analysis and a precision of terminology. So, showing that you know your stuff and that you can analyse the linguistic detail. There's also comment there on genre, mode and context. And our approach to any of these texts, I think, will need to try and bring together those three things, and that was discussed in the spoken language lessons that I did, bringing together representations, the context, i.e. genre, mode, producer, and the actual linguistic analysis as well. So I guess it's three parts. Is kind of the context of the text, the actual message that's being given, and the way that that message is being given. So you'll get a chance to practice these aspects in the assessment that's coming up. Back to this text then, we'll look at this Visiting Paris, which is Sophia and Mike, and you can see there a pair of trainers climbing the steps to the Eiffel Tower, which is something that they discuss in this text. If you haven't already read that text or that transcript, you should do so now. And you should be prepared to make notes. This lesson won't give you a close analysis of the text, but it will give you an idea for where to start your own close analysis. And previously, you were given a close analysis of Anna and Zara, so you can use that as a model. Obviously, for your own assessment, the task will be for you to produce your own close analysis rather than to produce mine, or reproduce one that you've been given. It's worth noting that the text, I can't remember how many pages this one is, but it's probably 7 or 8 pages. There is much more than can be given. You can't hope to kind of pre-analyse the text. You obviously should annotate them thoroughly, but having a good overall understanding of them is key, because an extract will be selected. So it's almost like a part to whole in that, you need to know the text well overall to be versatile enough to analyse whatever's put in front of you. You can't hope to kind of have a pre-prepared analysis ready to go, because you don't know what the question is, you don't know what the comparison text will be, and you don't know which particular extract will be used. So this text will lesson will definitely help you with your understanding of the representations in this text and the context of it, and it will give you an idea of where to start linguistic analysis. But the close analysis you'll need to do yourself as you complete your assessment. So let's look first of all then at a summary of the text. So Mike and Sophia, they're discussing their experiences of Paris as tourists, and they discuss things like the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre. They discuss their interactions with waiters, pickpocketing and scams, and travel on the metro, as well as a few other subtopics. Their conversation is focused on some of the problems that tourists face, and it's worth giving the precise understanding of the text, the kind of the nuance of the text. It seems that Sophia has more experience of Paris than Mike. Well, she definitely does. She's visited 3 times, he's visited once. That's an important contextual detail, and summarising this text, it seems that Sophia leads the direction of the conversation, but Mike gives the most extended contributions. And looking at that kind of conversational dynamic is the sort of sensitive understanding of the text that will give you confidence that anything that's put in front of you, you'll be able to explain. Some of their experiences are shared, and others perhaps are more individual experiences and not shared experiences. And it's interesting to think about where the speakers are fully in agreement and where perhaps there's a more individual account being given and another speaker doesn't agree, because that's reflected quite sensitively in the language within the use of politeness features in this text. So you need to have read this text, and it would be well worth rereading it or rereading a section of it after each slide here, or looking at it as you go through slide by slide to think about how these the summary, the context, and the representations are applied. So in terms of a more detailed blow by blow look at the context, you'll notice I've included in the little brownie orange box there just some of the key words from the mark scheme in terms of how you move up through the levels of looking at something like context, going from identifying and describing to analysing and evaluating the impact of context. So we know to get to analyse and evaluate, we need a detailed, applied knowledge of context. With regards to mode, this is obviously a spoken mode text. It's conversational spoken discourse. It's both spontaneous and it's interactive, fully spontaneous and fully interactive. In terms of genre, obviously that's closely related with mode. It's an informal conversation between two university students on the subject of their travel experiences. I suppose spoken texts don't conform to genres in the way that perhaps literature texts might, but it's definitely important context, or important to know that this is a conversation between two young people, two friendly young people. So I guess its genre is, informal, friendly conversation. There's a variety of purposes at play here, but this talk seems to have a social function in that speakers are building interpersonal relationships by sharing their experiences and looking for kind of shared understanding, if you like, of their topic. It's also expressive. They both give their individual feelings about Paris, and to a certain extent it's informative because speakers, I guess, are informing one another about their own experiences. With regards to audience, obviously in many of our written texts this is more straightforward, as in who is being written for or who is a text being produced for. Here in conversational speech, speakers are both speakers and audience, and so the producer and audience, if you like, in this text are one and the same. The producer and receiver, if you like, are one and the same. Both Mike and Sophia, they're both producing, but they're both also receiving, and they're speaking for each other. With regards to subjects, I gave you a little overview of that in the summary. Subjects, always helpful thinking about which subjects are represented in a text, because the questions do have a topic, and obviously we need to think about which other texts in the anthology this text could relate to. Well, of course, there are other texts that represent places like the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower, so famous Parisian tourist destinations might represent a question topic that would be used to connect this text to another. So we do need to think about the specific aspects of Paris that are represented within any given text. Which moves us nicely on to representations and what representations are made in this text. You will find your own detail with this, but here is my overview. Speakers, they give representations of their personal and individual experiences. And it's worth remembering, it's actually in the examiner's feedback there, that the speakers aren't just representing Paris, they're also representing themselves and their own experiences. And if you remember the triangle of representations that we looked at in the spoken discourse lessons, remember that any text producer represents all 3 points on that triangle. So they're representing who they're speaking to, they're representing themselves, and of course they're obviously representing their subject as well. Both speakers significantly give underwhelming experiences of visiting Paris, and particularly the famous attractions. So there's something anticlimactic about this text. They focus on negative aspects, Mike in particular does a fair bit of complaining about some of the things that he's been through, and Sophia seems generally sympathetic towards Mike's feelings, although she's probably on the whole a little bit more positive about Paris. Mike offers a representation of Parisian waiters as being rude towards or prejudiced against English speakers, and his language seems to have taken this fairly personally. And it's interesting because it's a point in the text at which perhaps their shared experiences diverge a little, and Sophia doesn't appear to relate, although she does obviously cooperate in this conversation with him. She doesn't disagree with him, but it's not an experience that she directly shares with him, and that's a subtle a part of their interaction that's worth looking at. Mike also represents the threat of being victim of a street scam, and how this was a potentially threatening experience or location for tourists. Quite an intimidating encounter that he had with street scammers, and Sophia is certainly quite sympathetic towards Mike for that. Both speakers do allude to these stereotypical representations of Paris. They cover, I guess, the main tourist attractions, the most common things, and some of the conversational topics that they cover are in some ways stereotyped representations of Paris. The rude waiters, the street musicians, the buskers, for example. They also offer other stereotype cliches which they both enjoy. They have some shared laughter about tourists and their selfie sticks. Sorry for the typo on that PowerPoint there. So it's interesting thinking about the function of stereotypical representations. Perhaps, I mean, yes, okay, stereotyping is, I guess, is lazy and can be seen as a negative way of talking about a topic, but stereotypes offer us readily accessible tropes or readily accessible ideas that we can share very easily in cooperative conversation. And so conversations, especially between people who perhaps don't know each other very closely but are having informal conversations, these conversations often use stereotypes as a means of cooperation and finding common ground. So it's important not to be too critical towards the individuals. We're not here to judge their personalities, we're here to judge their use of language. Next then, I've tried to organise these into subtitles, but be wary whenever it says, I mean, the examiner's feedback does say students need to use the language levels, and I know that you've been given 6 or 7 distinct language levels under which to analyse, but it doesn't mean that your analysis has to be strictly categorised into, lexis, grammar, discourse structure, because you'll find when you look at any example of language, you'll find that there is significant overlap between these things, particularly when you look at pragmatics. You look at the pragmatic aspects of a text, well, you're always looking at grammar and lexis to a certain extent when you look at those things. The key thing to think about is, my analysis of language focused on the key terms, the terminology and the detailed understanding that comes from looking at it using those language levels, the things that we've studied within the language levels. But you don't have to deal distinctly with a given topic and, oh my word, well that's definitely lexis and I'm talking about grammar, so I can't talk about lexis. No, it's important to be more broadly minded than that. So pragmatics, there are cooperative aspects to their conversation. The cooperative principles, Grice's maxims, they are very much in evidence and would provide a useful way of analysing this text, as are the politeness features. I don't think it would be possible to maybe analyse both, but if you go back and revise what we studied, you'll certainly find that these the cooperative principles and the politeness principles, they apply very much here, and they enable you to explain the function of some of those unique features of spoken discourse that we looked at. The turn taking, the hedging, back channeling, overlapping, laughter and filler, all provide examples of ways in which these two speakers cooperate through turn taking. The back channeling, I guess, shows that gives encouragement to speakers to continue on their topics. The overlapping often is points where there are a shared understanding, and the listening part of the listening person in the conversation, I guess, overlaps, not as a means of taking over the conversation, but as a means of reinforcing or giving their agreement to what's being said. There's numerous points in the text where there's shared laughter. That's obviously where suggesting that they're enjoying each other's company and that they're enjoying discussing and finding this shared ground, and they can always be meaningfully analysed. The grammar, of course, as with almost any spontaneous utterance, is deeply fragmented, and there are false starts and ellipsis, and it's possible to interpret those based on speakers' level of comfort or level of experience with the choice, the speaker's sense of direction within a conversation, the emotional attachment that they have to anything. It would be interesting to compare. There are some topics on which Mike doesn't really seem to have much to say. Does that mean that his grammar is more fragmented at those points? There's definitely, he has a lot to say about his personal experience of being approached by street scammers. Is that kind of more directed, more purposeful speech represented in the grammar? I can't tell you here, but you can look at that in your own close analysis. Both speakers use intensifiers to keep, or lots of linguistic features to try and maintain interest, but otherwise their speech is free of, I guess, literary devices, because this is an informal conversation, and so it has an informal colloquial register. The stresses represented in the text in bold are always meaningful. Why is this speaker stressing that particular word? How is it helping them maintain a topic? How does it relate to cooperation and politeness? In terms of the lexis, then, I already commented on how... I've skipped one there, topic control. Topic control is really good to look at. This is the best text, or one of the best texts, for looking at in terms of how topics are managed. I think that as I read this text, I see Sophia having control of topics and actually giving the conversation momentum in terms of moving topics on. She often introduces topics for Mike to talk about, and then gives Mike what function as sort of prompt questions or refinements to her topic question in order to try and get some response out of him. So Sophia is working very cooperatively within this conversation, and if you like, I think that Mike perhaps does more of the actual giving of experiences, and Sophia does much more in the way of actually generating the direction of conversation. It's an interesting idea for you to look at. Go back to the lessons that we did, revise the aspects of topic control that we looked at and the features used. They're definitely apparent in this text. In terms of the lexis of this text, it's informal. So what are those shared units of language that we use in informal speech that enable us to communicate effortlessly? They are colloquialisms and informal speech. They are pre-packed idioms, cliches, and collocates, which is words that are very commonly found together. All of those are related aspects of language, and they're all to a certain extent predictable. And again, we need to get beyond thinking of cliched language is a negative thing. Well, yes, in like academic writing, cliched language is a bad thing. In literary writing, cliched language is a bad thing. But natural cooperative speech is littered with cliches. And cliches are very, very useful units of speech in this context, because they effortlessly enable speakers to relate to something on a topic. And I guess they allow the conversation and the meaning, the transference of meaning within conversation to flow very easily, to have these kind of pre-packed little units of meaning that we can pick up very, very quickly and very clearly. We can also think, as we think in many of the texts, about the way that grammatical perspective is used flexibly. It is never as simple as this is a first-person experience, and so it's in the first person. First person and second person are used very flexibly, including the way that that these speakers address each other, but also the way that they sometimes use a second person to generalize their experiences. So where they're saying, "Oh, you do this," or "You go and do that," and then people do this to you, and what they're really talking about is their personal experience, but by framing their personal experience in the second person is potentially a politeness feature. They are generalizing that experience. They're making it more universal, less particular, and less direct, and therefore, in a sense, less threatening to and more inclusive to someone listening to them. Sorry for the really rather shocking typos in this PowerPoint. I will get them sorted. Finally, third person. It might be you could of course analyse the use of dexis and lexical reference in this, look at the way that speakers represent space, and it would be interesting to look at the third person, they, the waiters are they, the street hustlers are they, creating some kind of distance between the two speakers and their subject. Okay, the guide in the top corner there is very useful. This is the guide for analysis. You are looking for at least a relevant and coherent analysis. But for level 5, many of the features that I've discussed there with you would give you the opportunity to give a really accurate and sophisticated account of the language in this text, and that is the grand prize, level 5. Finally then, it's worth thinking. Once you have a look at the question, you'll see that on this occasion I've selected another spoken language text, and one that you're already familiar with, to compare. And the reason I've chosen 2 spoken language texts to compare for this assignment question is that we've looked specifically at spoken language, and it will give us an opportunity to think of the differences between, I suppose, a monologue and a conversational speech, and to compare in your assignment how those 2 different kinds of speech function. I'd say it's probably unlikely for AQA to select 2 spoken texts to be compared. They're probably much more likely to pair a spoken text with a multimodal text, or with a written text in a contrasting register. And remember that ultimately this course and this question is about contrasting styles and how well you as students can analyse the language used in different contexts to create different styles. So thinking about texts that have contrasts in terms of their style, or contrasts in terms of their context, or maybe have shared topic or certain shared aspects, this text, because of its negative representations of Paris, would contrast very sharply with those that seek to promote Paris or selling Paris. Those persuasive texts like the Eurostar advert or the Lonely Planet promotional travel videos, there would be a very, very clear contrast in the kind of language and the kinds of representations used. Other texts that could be used that would be similar in terms of giving personal recounts of Paris, i.e. an individualised experience of an aspect of Paris, but would have contrasting mode or register. So say, for example, we could contrast high literary registers in texts like Breathless and Foreign Correspondent, where these are very carefully planned texts that have low interaction, that are not spontaneous, and that obviously have a crafted literary register with all of the features that go with that, would make a very sharp contrast to the cliched and fragmented nature of spoken language in this text. Texts that use similarly less formal registers, but have different modes of communicating, modes that perhaps are more planned, such as French Milk. French Milk obviously is a cartoon strip, and it's multimodal in that it does a lot of its communication is done through the combination of text and image, and we will go on and look at that. But it has some of the informality features, or some of the spoken features. And Just Another American in Paris, the blog post, I suppose, belongs somewhere between a literary personal recount of Paris and a less formal spoken one. We know that many of these texts will have aspects of spoken language, we shouldn't look at modality in text as a text being either completely spoken or completely written in terms of a black and white distinction. There are texts that are certainly written but have features of spoken language, just as there are spoken modes of communication such as prepared speeches, which or speeches that are less spontaneous, which have features of written language. So we've got to think about that that difference in mode as a continuum, on which we can evaluate two texts. Finally then, interactive texts such as blog posts or forums, and they are to a certain degree spontaneous like conversations, although obviously you can delete a message before you post it, but they have much more of the spontaneity of spoken language, and yet they're written texts. Very interesting to maybe compare the Gransnet discussion on taking your grandkids to Paris with this text. Okay, so just to recap, if you check the folder or follow the link, you will see that the assessment there is published. There are 2 extracts in the assessment for you to analyse and compare. You should refer to the examiner's feedback that was given at the beginning of this PowerPoint as you plan. You should plan, and you shouldn't spend ages writing it, but you don't need to write this assignment to a tight time constraint, because actually the value in this assignment is you preparing to write about spoken text, spoken mode, and preparing to analyse. So do take the time to prepare your response to the question, to plan it carefully. Do take the time to write it up. You're not expected to write more than you would be able to in, say, 50 minutes of exam conditions. But if you want to take your time, obviously, over the planning and over the crafting of your response, then by all means do so. Instructions with regards to completing the assignment I will send out to you in an email with all of these details and a link to this video. So finally then, I hope you are all well. As well to you for completing the handmaids presentations. Loads of those were really good. There's 1 or 2 for me to chase, which I will send out emails about later. I hope you're all well. I hope you're finding the time to spend analysing Paris and looking at handmaids. We will move back onto handmaids and do some close analysis and guided analysis of handmaids in the future, in the next few weeks. Once again, hope you're all well. Thanks for your attention, and see you next time. Bye.